need of family members of disorders of consciousness to consciousness science. Haibo Di is a professor of physiology at Hangzhou Normal University in China, and Steven Laureys has many affiliations at University of Laval, Liège, Harvard, and Hangzhou. Is a quite superstar of disorders of consciousness and consciousness science. One might say the superstar of the field. And we are excited to have him talk today about the topic. Steven, the floor is all yours.
Oh, thank you so much. Haibo asked me to present today, and I need to thank you, of course, for welcoming him. And maybe I should share. So I'm a neurologist. I work in Belgium, but since recently also have the Canada Chair of Excellence and putting up a lab in Quebec. And then for many years now, collaborate with Haibo, who actually sent me an email. So that was many years ago, after the Lancet Neurology paper 2005 with Adrian Owen and Nicholas Schiff, the review on disorders of consciousness. An email he sent me doing fMRI in disorders of consciousness, and I never read that email. Many months later, I was searching for an email, and there popped up this request from Haibo to collaborate because he was doing own name presentation in what was at the time called vegetative state. And so I said, well, China is a big country. I'm in little Belgium. There's a great opportunity here. And so we worked together on this paper that then was published 2 years later in Neurology. And that was the start of a wonderful collaboration. And many student exchanges and sharing our passion, which basically is trying to understand that big mystery that is human consciousness, our thoughts, perceptions, emotions, and by measuring brain activity, decoding that, using this to help patients in coma and related states. So you see a couple of pictures here. First time we met, he came to Belgium and then came to New York, met these superstars, Nicholas Schiff, Cornell, Adrian Owen, now also in Canada. And then we had a number of wonderful visits both ways. And you see me here on this picture, Coma Science Group that I founded now 100 years ago, and a number of people you probably know here, and they're also very active in China, by the way, like first PhD student, Caroline Schnackers, now professor at California, LA, with Martin Monti, who she met in Liège and married. Olivier Gautzery, who's now a tenured professor and co-director of the Coma Science Group. Audrey doing hypnosis at Tina, Andrea Sodu, who was at the time postdoc and now is also in Canada next to Haibo, and then our friends from Milano, Marcello and Mario. So wonderful bunch of people, and then the idea to set up a team also in China, the Chinese Coma Science Group. And this is the famous paper from the missed email, but recovered through serendipity. A wonderful paper where Haibo showed many patients, you see here, different etiologies, and presented their own name, showing that the activity permitted to, well, disentangle unresponsive, what was at the time vegetative state, from minimally conscious, and also then continue that line of research, follow-up paper, BMC Medicine, that it has prognostic value, meaning the people after coma who survive but fail to communicate, who do show this more widespread activity to the self-referential stimulus, that is the own name, had a better outcome. And that then, as you can see here, led to our collaboration and many wonderful people working there. But of course, the challenge is to communicate. My Chinese is, even if I do believe in neuroplasticity, it's very, very limited. And then sometimes their English is also suboptimal. Haibo and I share this fascination for consciousness and disorders of consciousness, but also the power of the mind, and how also within this Eastern tradition, and we've been studying Buddhist monks. This is Mathieu Ricard, the translator of the Dalai Lama, that we've studied extensively in Liège, and it was a book, the No Nonsense Meditation book. And we continue actually that line of research with Haibo, you see here, and a Zen master in China, and how we have these EEG monitoring devices and the changes you see from the monkey mind. This is decoding the EEG into 120 components, permitting to visualize and to share with non-experts how we have this continuous brain activity and cognition, and basically what is called the monkey mind, one thought jumping to the other. And then you see this abrupt change and this kind of stability, these artificial colors showing here the capacity of these monks and Hindu masters, yogi, whatever their backgrounds, athletes of the mind, to keep their focus. And this is one example of such a recording. And for those interested, you're invited to see how this works in like non-monks and Buddhists. And this is my daughter. We just did a TEDx. You will see the results of how her brain monitoring with the simple device on stage of the TEDx. You can see it on YouTube. I will not spoil it here. So that's what we do together with Haibo. Coma, disorders of consciousness, so pathological modifications, but also pharmacological anesthesia, now psychedelics, and then physiological. I mentioned meditation, but we have a lot of data on hypnosis, sleep, dreaming, with all possible tools, historically PET, EEG, MRI, structural, functional, and neuromodulation with our TMS. So looking basically at the neurology of consciousness. Both of us, we come from the field of animal work, and basically the challenges are the same. So from my side, I started studying pain in the rat and felt very frustrated because I couldn't ask the rat, what do you feel? And we were doing these objective measures of monoamines in the thalamus. But it's still the same frustration when confronted to coma patients. And that's actually, I think, a historical error, that we've underestimated the capacity for consciousness in these non-communicative, being it other animals or newborns, or at the end of life also with demented patients we used to call vegetative when they could no longer communicate. Again, I gave a TEDx on this issue, and I was happy to sign the Cambridge Declaration on consciousness in non-human animals. And this is a big, I think, topic in the field of bioethics, that of course we are not the only ones to have consciousness, which is very challenging because we have no definition. How do we, reduce it, this complexity, thoughts, perceptions, emotions, where there is no consensus, no explanatory theory, and yet at the bedside we need to say something about patients' level and content of consciousness. So basically, using historically the Glasgow Coma Scale, we first appreciate eye-opening. That's an indicator of the level of consciousness or wakefulness, which is necessary but not sufficient, which is, of course, typical in coma patients. They cannot be awakened, and then they fail the awareness test, the content of consciousness, which is a very simple test. I ask people to do something. Squeeze my hand, do whatever, simple command. If they fail, such as in coma or general anesthesia, pharmacological coma, or so-called vegetative unresponsive wakefulness, did I really prove that they are fully without any capacity or sentience. Some other examples, epilepsy, complex partial seizures, absence seizures, sleepwalking. All of these conditions are characterized by the absence of a response to command and only automatic, so-called reflex motor activity. But it's very challenging, and it's been increasingly clear that many of these actually are sometimes a little bit conscious, which is minimally conscious state, maybe we should say minimally responsive state, an entity that was coined now 2 decades ago, and that we subcategorized into MCS minus, people showing non-reflex movements, which can be just a smile when the mother is in the room, and that's all you got, or visual tracking or orientation to pain. And then the next is MCS plus, is the patient answering to simple commands, but not in a way as in locked-in syndrome that permits you to establish a non-verbal code, where typically there, brainstem lesion, locked-in syndrome, intact brain, disconnected from motor control, only small movements of the eye permit them to express themselves. So I think, in a nutshell, the research of both our teams have shown that you have this global workspace, as Bars coined it, that is important for you to have awareness of environment and self. You see a number of examples here in these different neurological conditions where there is a dysfunction, disconnection in that global workspace. With Carl, many years ago, thanks to Melanie Bowley, who did her PhD with me, is now professor in Madison, Wisconsin. We're measuring the brain's response here to simple auditory stimuli, and then using dynamic causal modeling, looking at what seems to be different between these groups of people: coma, unresponsive wakefulness, minimally conscious state, locked-ins. And it seems to be that top-down feedback connection from the higher order to the lower, I would say, slave systems, auditory areas, secondary, primary, which are necessary but not sufficient for you to have consciousness of your environment. And of course, that's very, very interesting to help us in the hospital, because now we know that there is still this neuroplasticity, this capacity that some patients have after severe traumatic injury, hemorrhage, anoxia. And you see here the added value of the neuroimaging. And with Haibo, we have a number of papers documenting that truly sometimes we miss through our bedside examination the capacity of the brain for consciousness and hence a better prognosis. And you can, of course, use this to communicate with patients, the famous tennis paradigm, asking people to do something and decoding their brain activity, also with EEG. And with Haibo's team, we've done brain-computer interface studies. This is one paper of his group where we, again, ask people to answer a simple command. In this case, moving their hand. We don't look at the hand, but we look at the brain activity and can decode that. And then there are this minority of patients who do show surprising reactivity. So many papers in this field, and also the translation now to the clinic, and collaboration with industrial partners such as GTEC and the MindBeagle system. Very exciting to me is the study of the ultradian rhythmicity. So what we see in patients who are minimally conscious, and those who answer to simple commands also with the BCIs, is that there seems to be these windows of opportunity. So sometimes I examine them, they would react, I come back a couple of hours later, and there's just nothing anymore. And so we've been looking at that, and I think it's very exciting to better understand these spontaneous fluctuations throughout the day, where these patients would have, in this case, through the measure of long duration EEG, higher spectral entropy, very simple measure, where we see that every 70 minutes in MCS patients, there is this increase, not observed in unresponsive wakefulness, that we could exploit more in our diagnostic assessment with these tests, but also in the presentation of now neuromodulation and other novel therapies. Then there's the big bias, of course, that with all these fancy tests, you still need to understand language. And so that's a problem. The tennis test and these BCIs fail in MCS minus patients, where we showed that they have more left lateralized brain damage, here documented with glucose PET imaging. So we need to go to tests that do not require people to understand language. And that's the resting state paradigm. Very, very powerful for us, because you just have the patient in your scanner or high density EEG or MRI, PET, whatever, and you record whatever the activity is, here resting state, fMRI connectivity, and then you have these surprises where you think there's nothing. This is a classical complete locked-in syndrome patient with, you see the brainstem lesion. But sometimes, of course, the images lie to us. It's a false positive. We can be excited that we think we visualize consciousness, but all of these are very indirect measures. So we need to validate this, and there's no gold standard. This is very, very challenging. To use a new test, we don't really understand in the patient, we don't really understand whether he or she can be conscious. So that's the challenge. And of course, the now bigger cohorts, and of course, the collaboration with the big cohorts in China, where we have PET and EEG and MRI data sets, help us to reduce the uncertainty. Just, I mentioned Marcello and also Giulio Tononi, you know very well, and the perturbational complexity index, and then this capacity to, well, this challenge to use stereotactic TMS and measure the electrical echo, we call perturbational complexity index, seems to work very well. And of course, that does work even in aphasic patients, not understanding language or completely paralyzed or whatever confounding factors. So interesting, but very challenging, of course, to do in the clinic. A lot of studies using anesthesia, just some of the examples here, to cross-validate what we see in patients using different drugs. And again, you see this breakdown of the higher order associative areas. I think that's really where it happens, not in the sensory so-called slave systems. They can still be somehow connected and active even in pharmacological unconsciousness. So I still think it is useful to subdivide awareness in external sensory that seem to be more depending on these external frontotemporal parietal areas, and then the other, the more internal awareness, little voice in my head overlapping with the default mode, mesiofrontal, anterior cingulate, precuneus, posterior cingulate. And we have a number of studies challenging that. This is one in healthy volunteers. They're just laying in the scanner and telling us I'm more externally sensory aware, or internally, thinking about what do I need to do tomorrow or what happened yesterday. If you do that, you see a correlation, as you see there on the image, between the scores and those two networks. And you see that those networks anti-correlate. We do know that. External or executive also overlapping, and default mode or internal, and the scores also overlap. And then we checked actually that this can be disconnected in conditions like hypnosis, where you're dissociated, absorbed, or meditation, depending on the meditation practice. Melanie had a great idea to test that using a laser, looking at the impact of those spontaneous fluctuations in these networks on sensory perception. So she made the laser simulation of, in this case, she was making it so that the volunteers who had the laser on their hand, half of the time they would not feel it. And then she could predict, measuring the activity in the external and internal network, that yes, if the external is up, they would perceive it. If it is down, meaning the internal is up, they would not. And that has been published in PNAS and afterwards confirmed by other teams in the auditory modality. Haibo has been using a lot the own name as a autoreferential powerful stimulus. We know from the cocktail party, it attracts our attention, and use that using both fMRI and ERPs, and then the activity is seen in this midline core internal awareness network. And all of that is important because we do now know, and there was just recently a New England Journal of Medicine paper we did with the New York, London, Paris, and the other teams that joined. There is this cohort of patients where, despite our best possible clinical efforts, neuroimaging shows us surprises. So this misdiagnosis in so-called vegetative, now unresponsive wakefulness is of course important, should be avoided. So we improve the clinical assessment. And again, there we work with the Chinese team led by Haibo to translate, validate the coma recovery scale, which is a bit too complicated to learn and to do. So we proposed a new scale, which is the seconds. Again, we validated it for China. We have pain scales, an acceptance coma scale. All of that has been, as you can see, shared in a number of papers, basically repeating this now finding of patients with disorders of consciousness where there is more going on when you use these different neuroimaging techniques, and that challenges that corrects the clinical diagnosis. And in those patients, the prognosis is better. In terms of prognosis, a very early paper where we saw thalamocortical reconnections in a spontaneous recovery from vegetative unresponsive wakefulness, and then in those non-specific intralaminar thalamic nuclei, the team of Nicholas Schiff, Cornell, New York, put electrodes, bilateral stimulation, and published repeatedly that this improved patients' consciousness. So fascinating now to see that there's really a change in how we look at these patients, and that's ongoing work, rewriting the books. And I think we were too afraid to give families false hopes, had this kind of therapeutic nihilism. There's nothing we can do for none of these chronic disorders of consciousness. Now we know that's not true, that some of them retain this capacity of neuroplasticity, and that we can stimulate it through a number of new therapeutic interventions. With the team, we've invested a lot in the non-invasive neuromodulation techniques. The most studied, also together with the China team, is TDCS, transcranial direct current stimulation, where there is a clinical improvement, of course, not a cure, but the demonstration that we can stimulate that neuroplasticity. And that is important. I think neuroimaging is helping us reducing the diagnostic uncertainty, improving the prognosis, helping new therapeutic possibilities, and also, of course, helps us to appreciate better the capacity for the perception of pain and suffering. So again, with Haibo, we've not only invested in the high-tech neuroimaging assessments, but also the low-tech, but more, of course, widely available clinical scales. So we validated the nociception coma scale because it's clear, and you see here the Lancet Neurology paper with Melanie, where we show that noxious stimulation in MCS activates the whole pain matrix, very similar to what we see in healthy volunteers. So we need to be really more attentive and give painkillers in these patients. Um, Maybe a word also about our study on near-death experiences. So we have now thousands of patients and these incredible stories people tell us after coma. We see it in Europe, now I'm in North America, but also in China. We have a number of papers and try to understand what are the cultural differences between people in Europe or America. And China, we also observed with our colleagues in Russia, for example, that what I show here on the slide is that 90% and more are positive, a feeling of bliss. And Father Sergei, with who I work, Orthodox priest in St. Petersburg, he shares with me that half of his people he follows after intensive care, they share encounters with the devil and hell and so on and so forth. So for us, again, interesting to see how these physiological realities can be experienced differently throughout the world. And of course, the big challenge now is not just to publish high impact papers, but to really make sure that this new knowledge um, is translated to clinical reality. And there's a lot to be done there. Many hospitals do not have the facilities or resources to do these sophisticated neuroimaging tests. And also in terms of the rehab, it is now clear that neurorobotics, you see here our collaboration with Trainem Center in Antwerp, Amsterdam, Ghent, we have these patients who clearly improve, and we stimulate neuroplasticity, and we've shown that through neuroimaging papers, when you have these exoskeletons or these robotic arms that help them, and then you see simultaneously, we even do neuromodulation. Well, we also do that. You see here a strange patient on the Chinese robots. So really translating this knowledge about and understanding about neuroplasticity to improve the clinical care, quality of life of patients. And so it's been incredible to work with Haibo and team, and also to think together, well, how what are the ethical consequences of all of this? Of course, there's major decisions we take from intensive care through palliative care regarding to end of life. And we should respect, of course, the differences that are in large part related to religion, but also philosophy and traditions. Very interesting for me to discuss that with our Chinese colleagues, but also the right to access these technologies and have the best possible rehab in especially young TBI, traumatic brain injury patients, where really we can make a difference with these new interventions. And so together we did a number of surveys, and we put a lot of effort in this translational effort, also working with big volunteer groups and looking at the impact for the patient, of course, but also for the family, for the caregivers, very challenging. And we published, you see a number of papers there with Haibo on the risk of burnout in caregivers, and of course the need to address better patients' need, and that is kind of universal. They want to be more informed, more involved, have more support. And as you see on the graph, this is really highly important for them. And unfortunately, currently still, it is highly left unsatisfied when we go through these different surveys, both in the three continents where I'm now working. So, 谢谢. thank you very much. And I flew over this because I know that Carl and I look very much forward to it. And you all might have questions regarding everything that I briefly presented here. So thank you so much. And I really look forward to brainstorm with you how we can improve this international collaboration, because now we are getting really big data sets of both EEG, glucose PET imaging, and structural and functional MRI. And I know you are the big experts in terms of making sense of these data, doing modeling, doing big data crunching. And so I look forward to your ideas for further collaboration and pushing this field forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Stephen, for this fantastic talk. And let us all unmute ourselves and give a round of applause to Stephen and Haibo for their amazing work that's helping so many people and will help even more in the future. So usually we take now a few questions from the audience, but I know you are pressed on time, so I will take some questions from the audience if there are any, and if not, I will just give the floor to Carl. But yeah, so let's see. So until people collect their thoughts, maybe I can venture a question. I was totally 100% on what you said about the variability that happens in some patients, and I saw that with my, of course, limited experience in data analysis. I have this data set from China with minimally conscious state with an UVS and healthy volunteers. And I've been throwing all sorts of complexity measures at them, either temporal complexity measures like autocorrelation window or power law exponent, Lempel-Ziv, and stuff like that. And you see the trend, and it's significant p-values. You have significant p-values. The temporal windows are way longer in disorders of consciousness, progressively longer in unresponsive wakefulness, less so in minimally conscious states, and shorter in healthy volunteers. It's precisely the opposite pattern for Lempel-Ziv complexity. However, there are still outliers. You still see some people in these groups that you put, okay, this should be a responsive wakefulness, and they have very high Lempel-Ziv complexity. Of course, all data is noisy, and you cannot rule that out. But still, I agree with what you said. It's a problem of inference that you never know. We can never know fully how to track the uncertainty, the origin of the uncertainty in the result that we get.
Sorry? Yes?
So could you hear me?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. I was just checking my battery because I don't want it to go comatose, but it looks good. Thank you for that. Is this Haibo's data set, by the way, that you looked at in China, or?
I am not sure. I got it from Georg Nortov. It might be, but I'm not sure.
It's a different team. So we should give you also data from Hangzhou, because the more you get, I think, out of this noisy, there's a lot of these are EEG resting state data, right?
EEG resting state, all of them, yes.
So you got a lot of muscle artifact because these people have spasticity. The recording conditions are not optimal because by definition they're not collaborative. So you need to deal with the noise. As said, it's very challenging because we have no ground truth. Some of these patients we think are unresponsive might be what we call cognitive motor dissociation, and that makes sense. So that's why we're happy to cross-validate it with other markers such as glucose PET, which I think is still very useful there. And yeah, maybe through the more and more sophisticated ways to look at this, identify features that that do it better, depending on your question. Is it diagnostic? Is it prognostic? And then you throw in all the other variables, because the etiology is terribly important. It's a different story if you got laminar cortical necrosis after anoxia, then traumatic brain injury, then so it's very challenging. But I think it's great that people like you, and please reach out so that Haibo's team can look with the data set there, and then maybe the cross validation from other modalities. And so we try to avoid that circular reasoning, where we don't know what's happening. So yeah, that's the reality. But at least now there is so many teams doing this that through multicentric collaboration we can look at these data with the latest insights in terms of the pre-processing, which is critical, and denoising, and your ways of quantifying whatever measure of complexity and the like. Yeah, absolutely. And it's from the very strange results that we learn, of course, right? So we should definitely zoom in on these and understand it.
Certainly. So let's see. Thank you, Stephen, for your answer. Let's see if there are any other questions from the audience. We have quite a bit of attendees, 20. They flocked. So if not, maybe I would ask another quick question, and it's about those expert Zen meditators and that cutoff point where the EEG went into what? Went into theta, or what was the frequency?
So what I showed you there, so this is a very simple recording, right? We use the NeuroSteer, so this is an Israeli company, and the mathematics, it's comparable to the tools we have to decompose music. So you listen to a piece of music and you can extract this is the violin, this is the vocals. So you have these 120 components, and Nathan is a professor of mathematics from Tel Aviv, now in New York. And for me, it's a nice way to have a very simple portable device. I also use it when I'm on stage, and I can show the audience when this monk is meditating, or my daughter the last TEDx. But so you would see these 120 components, very challenging to, I'm not going to be too reductionistic and say this line is whatever cognitive function, but you do see the dynamics. And so you have these changes, right? Red, yellow, green, and then something happens. You have this change. You can also see it. We have simultaneous time frequency analysis. And there you can appreciate these bursts of gamma activity, right? So that we see in meditation, in really the experts. I didn't see it in my daughter yet. So yeah, I'm very, very impressed by this capacity, not only in these monks, by the way. When I'm traveling now, I can use it because we work with a number of top athletes. So we published on Guillaume Nery, that's a world champion apnea diving. And so he came to the lab, and then we did proper high density EEG monitoring and fMRI simultaneously, of course. And you see that he's actually quite close to what we see in the Buddhist monks. So really this state of flow, focus, despite the fact that he's not breathing for 8 minutes. And we see it also in Olympic champions who have this capacity also to, through their mental imagery, visualization techniques, to really disconnect. So it helps them to prepare. They would mentally go through this movement over and over and over again, but also to just do it, don't break under pressure at that specific time. And so they're incredibly good also. So we have a number of worked with gymnasts. They're of course not just physically trained. It's more and more clear that they're going through this mental training. yeah, this is wonderful for us to see these as examples of the power of the mind and translate that. This is also within the chair in Canada, my mission to document using high tech what I call complementary medicine. I think for too many years, my job as a neurologist was to make a diagnosis and to prescribe an intervention or a pill. And we forgot to give a more central active role to the patient. So now it's increasingly clear, of course, that meditation and other stress reduction techniques, but also physical activity, sleep, really are tremendously important and documented effect on neuroplasticity, on mental well-being, brain health. And so that's what we do, and learning from those extremes, translating it to our reality. And I see that you're walking or biking while doing a webinar, which is wonderful, wonderful, great example.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, I was surprised. I thought it was theta because usually I associated, from my, of course, limited knowledge, I associated gamma and beta with more engaged activities, especially since they were sitting, focusing on a single point. It made sense to have more slower waves, but apparently it's like the opposite. You get such a concerted mental aperture on a single point that it puts you in the generalized gamma.
Yeah, well, again, I think it's too simple to reduce. We need to specify what meditation practice we talk about, just to one frequency band. But yes, there's Antoine Lutz, who was the first to publish PNAS, these gamma activities. But your theta activity question makes me think of our recent paper in Neuroimage on near-death experiences, and we had the syncope experiment. So we had people faint, where, of course, you see slowing of the EEG, but there was this theta activity in temporal areas using source reconstruction, and that predicted the intensity of really the near-death-like experience. So that seemed to be this unique mixture of both cortical slowing and theta activity and higher frequencies in deeper limbic structures that correlated with the intensity of what they reported afterwards, this feeling of bliss, of out-of-body experience, and the like.
That's fascinating.
What makes sense, because we know that these frequencies are important for hippocampal cortical interactions, memory. So yeah.
Right. So let's see if there is anyone else from the audience. You do not need to be walking to ask a question. You can be sitting. I know. So if there are no questions, I think it's Carl's turn now, if I'm not mistaken.
It's my turn now, is it?
It seems so, Carl.
Everybody, we've got an enormous audience, and everybody is very shy. So that must be a reflection of the stature of our speakers. So Steve, when you say you're what did you say? You're a Centre of Excellence chair. Have you moved permanently to Quebec, or are you there on sabbatical, or?
Nothing is permanent in this world, Carl. So I got a lot of money. We're very happy. And by the way, we look for brilliant brains. So there's open positions for PhDs, postdoc. Please join us. My mission there is within the Cerveau Brain Research Center. That's part of the hospital. We have MRI, we're now buying a MEG, we have high-density EG, RTMS, all the usual stuff. But I keep my affiliation with Belgium. So as you know, I'm research director at the FNRS. And the mission is really to have this mixed joint unit. So with one foot on each continent. And then there's China. So
You've gone
I will
global.
be there for a couple of years, but spend a lot of time, of course. Now, for the moment, I'm in Belgium, so it's yeah, making sure we interact between both countries.
Before I make some laudatory comments and hopefully helpful comments, can I just ask one very specific question? I was intrigued by a number of things you said, but one thing that caught my eye was the um, persistent focus on anesthetics, well, focus on anesthetics and psychedelics, 5-HT2A agonists and related neuropharmacology. What do you see the role of these 5-HT2A agonists in your field? Do they have an enabling effect, a neuroplastic effect? Do they have? Could you use it to augment certain aspects of the 4 or 5 pillars of needs and satisfaction that you were presenting at the end?
We think so. So we looked at propofol, ketamine, psilocybin, and Olivia Gossery is leading this, and indeed proposing, because of its neuroplastic properties, will soon start the clinical trial in disorders of consciousness. Well, of course, the aim of anesthesia is to knock you out, and then we would see this breakdown of both external, internal networks, being fMRI, PET, or EEG. We used a lot propofol. But then when you look at ketamine, for example, where people, and that's also the work of Benedetta, can have this very rich internal world experience, and yeah, that I think is fascinating, to use those neurochemical interventions to better understand the neurophenomenology, but also, as you said, the possibility to help patients both in the field of neurology and neuropsychiatry. So you have David Nutt. There's a number of papers showing that this can also help people with major depression, and I'm very much convinced that we will see more of this in the field of neuropsychiatry, both the microdosing and then the full trip, which also in the hands of the therapists needs to the patient to give some meaning to what he is experiencing in these well, trips and this very complex, but I think real interaction between the rational Cartesian me and everything that happens under the radar, the pure emotional and everything that we went through in life. And so yeah, I think it's fascinating to see that there's now serious people using this in controlled clinical trials. And including myself, Carl, I was in London when they injected psilocybin into my veins, and I had the bad trip of my, so don't do that in an MRI. It was fun to see afterwards how my midline activity changed, but yeah, I know what it is to be one with the MRI machine and lose my ego, which took a time because there is so much, but
That's a good line. What was it? Was this at Imperial, was it?
Yes.
Yeah, they love doing that, depersonalizing you with the greatest of intentions. Thank you. Right, I'm aware you have to go soon, so I'm now going to indulge myself by trying to make some constructive comments. But I should qualify that you know everybody and you probably know everything. So there's very little I think I can say other than to admire this and to just see this in, as I say, global, international body of people really addressing an important problem from many perspectives. So what I've done is I've tried to identify people that you might not know so that you might be able to engage them. And I've also tried to do it with a sort of slightly pragmatic theme, which is the underlying disconnection or pathophysiology that is involved, and how that might speak to complementary ways of analysing both the fMRI, possibly resting state, and the EEG data. And within that remit, likely collaborators who have a joint interest in all the things that you've been talking about. But you've been talking about so much, it's difficult to find somebody who doesn't have a joint interest in one of the spheres. So what I'm going to do now, and I appreciate you may have to slide away during my stream of consciousness, and if so, then it's been lovely to see you again. But I'll just do this because it's been recorded, and I imagine a lot of your Chinese colleagues will probably get more from this going through the recording slowly, and having it properly interpreted, or at least they can review it a couple of several times. So if you'll indulge me, I'm going to grab the screen, and then what I've done is, while you were talking, I was picking out favorite papers and books and links in my world that spoke to some of the key issues in your bigger world. So if I can do that, let's go for a screen. Now, my fond hope is that you can see my screen now. Actually, by pure chance, this is actually very relevant, because it is indeed the ex-imperial team talking about the potential role of, in this instance, well, referring to 5-HT2A agonists and the like, and their potential role, not just in terms of modulating synaptic plasticity of deep pyramidal cells, but also having a more enduring neuroplastic effect, and trying to generalize that notion in the spirit of canalization on Waddington landscapes, and sort of getting stuck in a rut and relieving that. So I imagine that you know this. It might be an interesting game just to reconnect with Robin Carhart-Harris and see where he is in this space. And I thought that simply because of the deep connections between say assisted therapy in psychotherapy, or assisted or indeed in end of life care, and the neuropharmacology that you repeatedly referred to, emphasizing the fluctuating disconnections that you get at many different timescales in the brain, that presumably, because in virtue of their fluctuation, have to speak to some modulation of the synaptic efficacies and plasticity on a relatively short time scale. So I just put that up, and I will now, just for a point of reference, that this was a nice summary written by Robin, effectively, with a lot of other players with various, do you know Shamil Chandara? Okay, he'll come back later, but it might be another person of interest to speak to. So let me get rid of that, but I'm not quite sure where it is. Here it is. One person. Have you spoken to Mark Soames? Do you know Mark Soames?
Not personally,
No.
very well, no.
No, I wonder whether you would. I think possibly more of as a fireside chat on a podcast, but certainly it would be worth looking at his work. So just very briefly, Mark Soames plays a dual role. First of all, he's the editor of the RSE, the Revised Standard Edition, after 30 years. There's now a new edition of Complete Works of Freud. He spent 30 years doing that. So he's a world's expert on Freud. But I think, more in parallel, he's also one of the fathers of the neuropsychoanalysis movement, and was a great friend of Panskep, who I noticed co-signed your declaration. So taking a very biological approach to yeah, consciousness as it plays out in an analytic and neuropsychological context, and not dissimilar from Nico Schiff's perspective, but much more towards the implications for how patients feel, and the phenomenology of that, and then treading on the toes of the hard problem of consciousness. His main story, which has been articulated in many venues, but summarized in this more recent book, The Hidden Spring, is that to feel is to have a viable source, cells of origin of the classical neuromodulators, loosely defined in his world in terms of the reticular activating system, but I'm sure Nico Schiff would sort of tie that down. So he's trying to tie together the phenomenology of experience, which he calls feeling, to the afferents, to the cells of origin of the monoamine and catecholamine systems, and thereby putting the heart of experience and feeling not in the cortex that is enabled by, but in the subcortex that is required to do that kind of ignition and facilitation. So, and he has a lot of neuropsychological evidence that very powerfully speaks to this sort of inversion of where experience and consciousness is, which I thought was interesting just because it can be articulated purely in terms of neurotransmission and neuromodulation, and yet he can talk quite fluently about consciousness and feeling and experience. So I don't think he knows or works in the kind of consciousness research that you've been talking about. But it did strike me it would be really interesting to get the two of you, or possibly the three of you, in a room together, just talking about these mechanisms from various perspectives. Another, I was about to sort of suggest you have a chat with Julia Raffini, and then I notice you on the scientific advisor. So that's not going to be, that's not very useful. But for everybody else on the call, another useful interaction would have been with this the academics at this company called Neuroelectrics. I think in Barcelona, aren't they? And they just came to mind not only because of their attempts to integrate neuroplasticity and direct TDS, which I know Saber was involved in, or direct stimulation of one kind of another, but to look how it interacts with psilocybin. So that was the SHINE project, which I don't know if you remember that, but apparently they're going to reapply for that. So I thought it was an interesting connection. But also they came here last week and have a very impressive array of different stimulation approaches, looking at looking at modulating the tone and the ensuing neuroplasticity following repetitive direct stimulation, predicated on individualized models of dynamics on structure using sort of connectomes, very much in the spirit of the Virtual Brain Project by Petra Ritter and Victor Jersa, but independently, more aligned with, as you know, sort of Gustavo Deco. I was just impressed with the sophistication and how far they've got in having personalized stimulation paradigms predicated on some very high-end modeling and imaging image analysis. So, but you already know them, so that I don't need to worry about that anymore. This is a group of people who are coming at consciousness from a purely philosophical and possibly academic perspective, trying to find an explanation in the philosophy of consciousness that is inclusive and would happily accommodate global workspace through to Chris Field's new inner screen hypothesis, and formulating it in a way that can be articulated in terms of this modulatory connection between cortical and subcortical regions, where the connectivity is dependent upon the neuromodulatory status, which from the point of view of computational neuroscience and things like predictive coding and active inference is thought to represent the way in which the brain would represent uncertainty or confidence. So this is a theme which I thought was quite central to a lot of what you're talking about, that there's, again, coming back to this notion that these states fluctuate over many different timescales, telling you immediately that we're in the realm of a of a pathophysiology that is not necessarily a reflection of an aberrant structural lesion, but a failure to coordinate through setting the right neuromodulatory tone, which I repeat in predictive coding formulations is a way of assigning the right precision to various prediction errors and predictions in this recurrent hierarchical message passing. In cognitive science would underwrite sort of sense making and, interestingly, planning and articulating the consequences of those plans. But this, I repeat, is really from a bunch of people writing as philosophers, trying to find these sort of minimal models that would accommodate, well, let's take global workspace, or certainly Standerhan's version of global neuronal workspace, where the ignition rests upon assigning the right precision or gain to the lower level regions so that it now can influence belief updating or evidence accumulation at high levels, very much in the spirit that you were showing that sort of double dissociation or yin yang between the higher self-modeling, self-inference versus inferring sense making about the sensorium and what's out there. So I thought that might be an interesting literature to connect with, which is reads consciousness in a much more philosophical way, but still can be grounded in the pathologies and the disconnections that characterize a more empirical approach. I put this up just because as a nod to Alan Hobson. Do you remember Alan Hobson? Yeah. So he made me write this effectively, which was putting effectively, it was Geoffrey Hinton's wake-sleep cycle algorithm into neurobiology and linking it to consciousness. But the theme was identical. It was, again, a neuromodulatory, very consistent with his AIM model, that if you can sequester these lower level sensory and motor cortical levels from the higher levels, then you've got this notion of introspection. You associate this with the default mode, planning, dreaming, mind wandering, simply because you've lost those constraints, because there are no precise prediction errors or precise newsworthy information coming from the lower levels, because you've disconnected it, in this instance transiently, during fluctuations between, say, the 4 sleep stages, to different degrees. So I just put that up as another, if you like, direction or perspective on an interpretation of the importance of getting the right context-sensitive coordination and connectivity in play, which I repeat really rests upon the way that the brain sort of attends to or ignores or attenuates, effectively assigning the right precision or confidence to, subpersonal confidence or precision to the sources or afferents that induce belief updating in the brain. Just slightly out of place here, but that was simulated numerically in this paper, which is, I'm putting up really as a numerical proof of principle that you can actually get people, you can actually simulate people introspecting, thinking about things, finding solutions, just using this a first principle account of trying to get the right world model, the right generative model in play, and doing so by attenuating the precision of information from the sensorium so that you can introspect. And then when one can then sort of find better models of at least your world model, sorry, of your lived world. Just yeah, let me just quickly, yeah. This kind of work has been taken along with Antoine by a gentleman called Lars Sandved Smith, who was a colleague, a mentee, perhaps, of Thomas Metzinger, with an eye on what would happen if you now had deeper levels of some hierarchical generative model that were contextualizing and informing the precision or the modulation of message passing at lower levels. And he takes this not in the direction of pathology or changes in both the level and the content of consciousness, but in terms of the implications for phenomenology, and particularly the phenomenology of self, and talks about sort of second and third order hierarchical levels that provide at least a sort of mathematical, I don't know if we've got some nice pictures here, where he sort of builds on elemental predictive coding or active inference schemes to say that this might be an appropriate way to look at neural dynamics in terms of belief updating in a way that supports at least a space for things like meta-awareness and self-awareness, recognizing that I am awake or I am in this particular intentional set or perceptual set, and thereby coordinating by sending descending predictions of the precision or the confidence that one would place in one modality or another modality, basically establishing the right kind of attentional perceptual set. Invert the fact you recognize that you are you, and you are in this particular intentional and or perceptual set. So just again, if you come across these people, or if you speak to Antoine, in the near future, then it might be worthwhile looking at the work of this purely as, if you like, reaching out to another community. This community is just interested in phenomenology. That's the new field of neurophenomenology. And then I think Thomas Metzinger has actually got a prize for the people who can write the best essay about the minimal phenomenal experience, which may have some relationship to a minimally conscious state. So, and the reason I mentioned Shamil earlier on is that Shamil was on the panel to judge all of these prizes for the best essay on the basis of the MP, the minimal phenomenological experience that you get in certain meditative states of a really pure sort, so non-dual states. And then Shamil had to resign from the panel because he actually wrote 2 papers of his own and submitted them for the prize. So just again, a convergence of different different investments and different perspectives on the same fundamental issue. I thought was entertaining and interesting. I just spoke about or you spoke about Antoine. And he has also, so Jeremy was one of our old students who also got quite deeply into active inference in the early days, organized some of the first active inference workshops. So this was just a treatment of predictive coding, one of many of meditation, but again emphasizes the ability to become skilled in the deployment of these descending predictions that implement attentional selection or attentional gain or postsynaptic gain or neuromodulation that encodes the uncertainty or the precision of various messages around the brain, which I think does speak at least in part to some of the ideas that you were talking about. And that brings me to the final. Oh no, what's this one? Oh, this is the original Rebus one of the psilocybin experiences. The final thing that struck me was just a bit of pragmatic, a pragmatic suggestion. I notice there was, when discussing with Robert about different measures of complexity and your word of caution about just focusing on gamma and the like. I wonder whether it is time to go back to Melanie Bowley science circa 2000, whenever it was, and start to get back into dynamic causal modeling. Because all of these phenomena, all of these complexity phenomena, lentils, if I pronounce that correctly, entropy measures, they are all effectively measures of the dynamical stability of the brain at this point in time. That dynamical stability is a direct consequence of the excitability of all the neural populations that are interconnected. That excitability just is the target of this precision control or neuromodulation. So I would imagine that the most robust, reliable, and interpretable measures of disconnection or disintegration in a Bleuerian sense that underwrites these altered states of consciousness is simply a measure of the excitability or the affected connectivity between one cortical region and another cortical region. The differences in that kind of modulatory disconnection or functional disconnection will, I'm sure, be, I suspect would be the right way to incorporate the heterogeneity of the way that the patients can present. But there is a common underlying theme, which is that you've lost the ability to modulate the excitability of various neural populations. To measure that explicitly, one's going to need a generative or a forward model that is parameterized in terms of this kind of affected connectivity. And certainly studies are applying dynamic causal modeling to things like schizophrenia. Almost universally reduce to abnormalities not in the between cortical region or cortical subcortical connectivity, but in the intrinsic excitability that just is the target of neuromodulators and psilocybin and anesthetics. It's just taking it's just setting the tone. So that's parameterized in dynamic causal modeling by recurrent self-inhibition, and you can estimate that from fMRI time series and EEG time series. If you build a generative model that has the right structure, possibly informed by a connectome or a structural connectome, but then you put the right kind of dynamics on, sort of usually neural mass of the kind that Janssen and Rick used to use, or we use now in dynamic causal modeling. And Giulio Ruffini is starting to use, as does Gustavo Decco of a phenomenal sort, to try and model dynamics on structure, and then look at this crucially important parameter, which is the intrinsic excitability. And if you can estimate that, I think that would be a really useful practical tool to endophenotype both the state of connectivity in this brain at this moment and its fluctuations over 70 minutes, over a day, over a month during recovery, for example, or with perturbations that affect that intrinsic excitability, such as psilocybin, should you want to administer it to anybody else intravenously. The person I think you should talk to is really the sort of this is a student of Adil Razi, who is in Melbourne working at the same place that Jacob Howie works. And Jacob Howie is one of the good and great in philosophy of predictive processing, and particularly the importance of this. The reason I mention Adil, this is one of many papers that he's written. He's the world expert in applying dynamic causal modeling to resting state fMRI. And my guess is that your Chinese colleagues probably have access to really useful large data of resting state fMRI. And in principle, it should be fairly straightforward with a bit of hand-holding to apply DCM for complex cross spectra. So basically, you summarize these resting state time series over a period of which you think the connectivity is roughly stable, in terms of their cross spectra, and the cross spectra keeps all the phase delays in play as well. And then you fit your model, and then you can identify differences in the intrinsic excitability of different regions, enabling you now to phenotype and to get the sort of excitability fingerprint that might correlate with certain, with all the other measures that you've got. Interestingly, it should also generate spectra that if you applied entropy, or if you generated data that had the same kind of spectra, you would probably be able to reproduce all the complexity measures. So, on this view, because you've got a forward or a generative model explaining your data, you can generate the data. If you can generate the data, you can apply all one's descriptive measures, such as even the perturbational complexity index, because in silico, you can now, because you've effectively got a digital twin of this patient, you can look at the responses to various interventions and start to reproduce the kind of measures, and thereby validate those more descriptive measures with these measures that inherit from a proper generative model of the neuronal dynamics and the message passing. So that was my practical suggestion. The other reason I highlight a deal is, just to close the circle, is that his group also has just been funded by the ARC to do a really in-depth study of psilocybin. So he's also not only an expert in characterizing resting state fMRI, as are people like Susan Gabrielli Whitfield and the like, but he's also an expert in, or has a deep interest in, manipulating brain states through the administration of exactly the kind of pharmacological agents that target this sort of modulatory. So I think he's a bit busy at the moment because he's just organised a NeurIPS workshop with Yoshio Benjo in Montreal. But I think he would be the sort of person that you might be usefully engaged just to help some of the Chinese colleagues make sense of their data, if they have resting state data, and to see how far you can push that, and then possibly get a PhD student then to say, well, okay, I've now got a network model of this person. Now can I simulate all the complexity measures and the entry measures and make sure that they have a sensible relationship to how I understand now the disintegration or the failure to modulate from the brainstem, for example, or coordinate the exchange of dynamics between the areas. So that was my rapid, breathless feedback, and you're still here. I thought you had to rush off to.
Thank you so much.
So just to add a little note to your stream of consciousness, mentioning Anil's ERC project on neurophenomenology, which uses predictive processing for studying the various aspects of phenomenology, but also focuses on formalized notions of emergence that might be useful for cases that Steven and Haibo are interested in.
Could you get that? Robert, could you find a screen grab? So there's, if you just put it up on the screen, so there's a video recording, so people can go to that site, or your favorite paper.
Yeah, it's just an ERC project, so I'm not sure whether there is anything as a paper yet. It just started. It's where I got the postdoc card to
Excellent.
work.
Yeah. Okay. And yes, there was a connection with the Neil Seth in there, a deep one, but I forgot to highlight it. It's like small world connectivity, isn't it?
Yeah, because he was part of the paper on neurophenomenology.
Yes, absolutely. There was that. Yes, but there are, as you point out, there are other deep connections. And interestingly, Anil also is an expert in Granger causality and measures of complexity,
Yes.
and try to relate them in a very similar way to things like IIT and measures of five or integrated information. But as part of that endeavor, also just comparing and contrasting Granger causality with dynamic causal modeling.
With this,
And there is a bright line. Yeah. So again, yeah, he would have his investment in these conversations would be multilateral. Absolutely.
Yeah, we collaborated and published with Anil already. So yeah, it's wonderful to have your feedback and wisdom. I'm looking at my watch, trying to find the most provocative question I possibly can come up with, Carl, for you. So trying to understand consciousness is really terribly challenging, right? Chalmers, the hard problem. Some argue that maybe we need to look at quantum properties, and for a long time we said this is nonsense and only observable at low temperatures. Now we know, well, photosynthesis, maybe how birds find their way on the Earth's magnetic field. With all your wisdom and nerdness, do you think that we should look there?
I think you should look at the maths of quantum information theory. I don't think you should get out your favorite microscope and start looking at the nanoscale. I think that would be a complete waste of time. You've intimated as much as yourself in terms of just the notion of emergence completely precludes any useful insight from looking at, say, nanotubal or quantum formulations of consciousness. However, there is some beautiful maths and there is some beautiful theory in quantum mechanics. And if you take that and apply it at the macroscopic level of an embodied brain that has experiences at the scale that experiences live, then I think that would be certainly worth looking at. And it is not my field, but given I am old and wise, because I am old, I can point you to the work of Chris Fields on quantum information treatments of self-organization and active inference. And what he's basically doing there is taking a scale-free or a scale-invariant approach to quantum physics in the form of quantum information theory and seeing where that leads in terms of understanding consciousness. The denouement of that is interestingly in the title of the third paper that I showed, which is the inner screen hypothesis. So this is the idea that you've got screens within screens within screens within screens, where a screen is a holographic screen that complies with the holographic principle from quantum mechanics. What that basic, well, quantum information theory, and the idea is that they're summarized in that paper I flashed up, that there is an irreducible holographic screen whose internal dynamics, which could be very distributed in the brain, and is more than likely to include these the cells of origin of the reticular activating of the classical neuromodulators, have no way of representing themselves other than broadcasting to screens that are nested outside. And that characteristic may he thinks may explain sort of consciousness in a philosophical sense, or that in the sense of representing oneself and the impossibility of ever representing oneself because of the obvious infinite recursion that you induce. The other approach is to go to photonics, where and I say that because in artificial consciousness or intelligence research, that's where people, I think, are looking for in the future the right kind of implementation of sentient machines that may or may not have the right kind of planning agency and self-modeling to support notions of consciousness and indeed experience. And part of that move is to become more like the brain. And to become more like the brain, you've got to have now those neuromorphic aspects to it. and simple things like having receptive fields tells you immediately that the brain has now tiled some perceptual space, and that tiling is quantization. So now the maths of quantum mechanics now reapply, simply because the brain has carved nature at its joints into discrete representations. And what that means is that you can now apply the maths of quantum mechanics to discrete state space generative or world models that you might hypothesize represent the way that we make sense of the world and carve nature at its joints. So you're not really using quantum physics, but you're using quantum operators to understand belief updating in the brain and how that is implemented in terms of neuronal dynamics that can be now articulated using exactly the same operators that are used in quantum physics. Physically, how might you do that? Probably the best thing is probably not quantum computing. It's too expensive, and only rich people can afford to build the right machines. But you can do it with photonics. You can do it instead of using wires and von Neumann machines. You can just use it using fiber optics and get really efficient, fast quantum-like computations. And then I guess you'd be asking, well, how do you render it unconscious? You would be basically in the game of injecting some psilocybin and basically breaking the fiber optic tracts in a careful way that they can be restored once you come through your bad trip.
Thank you so much. I give you a big virtual hug, and I'm gonna leave you and also leave Haibo. I think he is with us, but
yes, he has been. Yeah.
To all of you, and we stay in touch.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I think it's a very good chance. It's okay. Okay. So thank you, Carl. Okay.
My pleasure.
So it's a very good chance for me and a group to learn from you, and also you kindly share your understanding of the consciousness and also give us a lot of suggestions. And I think Steven, because you know everything of Chinese affairs, so and with bigger English and a very high level perspective, and so I want to know if someone else record this meeting, could send this recording to me, and I think it's very helpful.
Yes.
Thank her, because for my visiting English, you give me a very huge help with your invitation letters. Thank you so much, and I hope next time, if possible, I can meet with you in London maybe next year. Thank you so much. I think Steven maybe is very limited time, and he will be Lee. So thank you so much.
No, it was a great pleasure. Thank you very much for coming. And before you got here, we did say that we were going to record it for you and your friends in China, so that you can go through the conversation, the early conversation, and then the debrief slowly, so that my English accent is not a problem in terms of you understanding. But thank you very much for coming, and I look forward to seeing you next year when you're next in London.
Yeah, thank you, Carl, and thank you, Steven. Thank you, the master. Thank you so much.
Very, very good. So thank you all for being here to this wonderful TMB meeting, and we wish you all farewell until next week. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Carl, please stop the recording.
Bye.
Well done.